Welcome back. This is John Locke. Today I'm answering a question about user experience and SEO from the big SEO board on Reddit. This question deals directly with breadcrumbs, and we'll look at an example and I will give my thoughts on this. Now, before we get into this, I'm going to say that it sounds like this was probably written by someone who's mostly doing web development or visual design, web design, not necessarily somebody that does SEO on a regular basis, but we'll talk about these thoughts because this is a valid question. All right, this person says, would there be any SEO value to putting breadcrumbs in the footer? And they say, howdy. I've heard enough about breadcrumbs being good for SEO to finally think about putting them in my website. Personally, I've never found myself using breadcrumbs on other sites, so I've never really bothered before. I subscribe to the idea that if your visitors need to rely on breadcrumbs to get around, there's likely a problem with your site structure. That's what makes me think web designer or web developer. Okay, that said, if there's any benefit to it and not really any downside, I suppose it's worth adding. The problem is that on my website there isn't any aesthetically pleasing place that I found to put them. That makes me think web designer, by the way. Besides, at the end of the footer. Interesting place. Above the scroll to top button, the scroll to top button, usually on most sites it's like right about here. Okay, so that it doesn't look out of place. Again, not so much for users to use, though if they do after they've scrolled to the end of the page, then great. But if anything, to help search engines to understand site structure and the marginal SEO benefit. How do you know it's marginal? Okay, as a prominent example, Apple.com has their breadcrumbs in the footer, so it's not unheard of. On the other hand, links and footers are generally regarded to have lower or negligible SEO value. I've been spending more time thinking about the pros and cons than I think it's worth at this point, so I thought I should probably just ask the SEO virtuosos over here, would there be any SEO benefit to adding breadcrumbs in the footer? Should I really just try hard to find a good place for them in the content body? Thanks for any input. It's all appreciated. Okay, this is a valid question, but okay, you're using Apple as an example of where to put breadcrumbs. And I'll show you what this is. Okay, so this is the page that he's talking about for the iPhone SE. Way down at the bottom of this page. Okay, right here is the breadcrumbs. Okay, there's the home page. There's the next level up, iPhone SE. Okay. Well, this is how breadcrumbs usually show up in search results. So this is that page. Here's the home page, and then iPhone SE, and then also right here specs, Apple, iPhone SE, and then specs is a section or maybe a different page. And then this one, you can see it's apple.com, iPhone SE. It says iPhone first, though that's not really part of the URL path. It's part of the breadcrumb path, which I think is important to note. And then iPhone SE, and then Y upgrade. Okay, so the breadcrumb in these two cases actually have an extra path that is not in the actual URL. Okay, so you have the click to the iPhone. Now, why would Apple do this? Apple would do this because generally they have really long pages that are more about visual design. It's not a lot of text. It's more about showing you. Very little text on these. But very long landing pages that, take a long time to produce. A lot of talent, a lot of work to produce these, all these different little scroll jacking effects. But there's no breadcrumbs up here. There is a link to the page right here, which is the page that you're on, which is kind of weird. And then that's the home page, but there's no breadcrumbs up here. I think that Apple chooses to do this because they focus more on just telling a story visually. I think that most brands are not necessarily going to be able to get away with this, or it wouldn't make sense. Most people are going to scroll through this, especially people who are Apple fanboys, right? Okay. But for most utilitarian websites, like a service business, a contractor, HVAC site, painting site, like a painting contractor, or any type of construction or blue collar, or any type of service business, or even an e-commerce site, um, you're going to want the breadcrumbs at the top of the page. Okay, just because you don't use breadcrumbs doesn't mean that your users don't use breadcrumbs, okay? And having breadcrumbs at the top of the page, like for an e-commerce site, it's useful. Or for a service site, being able to click to stuff very quickly, if it's like right up here, like right underneath the header or something, you can get to a different page very quickly without having to navigate through stuff like this. Not every piece of navigation is clear cut. So this statement about, well, if they need breadcrumbs and your site structure sucks, yeah, I don't believe in that. Okay, the biggest thing really, and maybe you'll get a little SEO benefit from it, just mostly from just looks a little bit better in the search results. Maybe people will click it. But the biggest thing is really this is like for the users. It's just making it easy for people to navigate your site. And at the end of the day, Google does measure how people interact with your site. So that is a very critical factor. So you really should take into consideration how the majority of your users actually navigate your site, how they actually use it, and what would be most helpful to them. So if you do those things, yes, it has an effect on SEO. Not simply because you have breadcrumbs, like it doesn't just instantly say, like Google says, we see breadcrumbs on this page, we're going to rank it a little bit higher because it is breadcrumbs. It's more an effect of people are using the site, and if there's a very clear visual hierarchy, good navigation, the pages have the correct information, it's easy to find, and they want to navigate to a different page and you make it very easy, then that is something that Google measures through user activity. So this would be a compelling reason to put breadcrumbs at the top of the page. The location of it should be based on how much utility people are going to get out of it. Because, I mean, quite honestly, even people who are Apple fanboys, they're very unlikely to scroll all the way down here and find this. And honestly, this doesn't stick out a whole lot with all this other, navigation menus at the very bottom. Doesn't stick out a whole ton. But for most sites, it's going to be the most useful to have the breadcrumbs pretty much near the top of the page. Doesn't need to necessarily be above the fold, but near the top of the fold. Somewhere in a prominent place where it's easy to find, easy to click. I usually, put these on all different types of industrial sites or manufacturing sites. Seems to help. And quite honestly, it's not going to hurt. So that's, for me, it's like just about being usable, user-friendly. So, I mean, you can sit there and say like, hey, Apple does this, or I don't want to do it, or I don't click on breadcrumbs, or, your site structure sucks if you have to have them. That's all well and good, but I think that the data in the majority of websites is not going to back up those opinions. So, yeah, if I were you, I would try harder to find a good place that's near the top of the page. Because the easier that people can use your site and find what they're looking for, the better that's going to be for your SEO over the long term. My name is John Locke. My business is Lockdown Design and SEO. I'm here, like every other day making videos. Getting nearer to 1,000 subscribers. I'd like to see that get to 1,000. That would be awesome. As you can see, we have a ton of videos here. I think it's, how many we got? Like 730 videos on SEO. So if you have a question, leave it in the comments below this video. be happy to answer that. And I'll be back again in a couple days with a new SEO video. And until next time, peace.